In a tranquil village nestled at the foot of a mountain surrounded by endless green rice fields lived an old man named Thin. He was 71 years old, a humble farmer who spent his days tending a small garden, a few chickens, and a loyal old dog. His home was a modest house with a red-tiled roof that had faded with time. The villagers often saw him in his simple attire, an old, worn-out ao ba ba and rubber sandals with frayed soles. Every morning he would take his dog out to the fields, and by evening he'd sit on his porch, sipping tea while watching the sunset. But unlike the other elderly in the village, Thin exuded a mysterious aura. Tall and lean, his calloused hands remained strong, and his sharp, penetrating eyes told a story of a life that had seen both hardship and resilience. The villagers admired him not only for his kindness and willingness to help, but also for his quiet strength. However, beyond casual chats about weather or crops, no one truly knew much about his past. This peaceful life took a dark turn one day when a group of strangers arrived in the village. They roared in on noisy motorbikes, wearing black leather jackets and radiating an air of menace. The leader, a man in his 30s with a buzz cut and a long scar running from his left eye to his chin, was known as Hai Lua, High the Flame, a name that alone conjured images of danger and volatility. At first, the group simply loitered, surveying the village as if assessing their territory, but it didn't take long for their true intentions to surface. One by one, they began to visit homes and businesses, starting with the small general store owned by Mrs. Min and the humble noodle shop run by Mr. Dung. Their demands were clear: pay a protection fee or face the consequences. Those who hesitated found their windows shattered and their goods destroyed. The village, once harmonious and quiet, was now gripped with fear and anxiety. One morning, as the sun rose above the treetops, Thin made his way to Mrs. Min's store to buy sugar and cooking oil. The small shop, with its modest shelves, had been his go-to spot for decades. But today, the usual calm was gone. As Thin entered, he noticed Mrs. Min standing behind the counter, her face pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a small fabric pouch. Blocking the aisle were 3 men, all clad in black jackets, their voices loud and threatening. "Listen carefully, old lady," growled one of the men, a burly figure covered in tattoos. $5 million a month. If not, this shop won't stay intact for long." Mrs. Min stammered, her voice barely audible. I don't have that kind of money. I only run a small shop." "No money?" sneered another man, his laugh cruel and cold. "Then sell your land, sell your house, but don't think you can avoid paying us." As the men laughed and taunted, Thin quietly placed his conical hat on a nearby shelf. His eyes scanned the scene, Mrs. Min's trembling hands, the mocking thugs, and the fear that filled the air. After a pause, he finally spoke. His voice was deep, calm, but firm. "Do you think what you're doing makes you men?" The 3 turned to him, their eyes narrowing. One of them smirked, stepping forward with an arrogant tilt of his chin. "Who's this old man? You want to butt into our business, huh?" Thin stepped closer, unflinching. "I'm just a neighbor," he said evenly. "But what you're doing here is wrong, and someone needs to tell you that. You have hands and feet. Why not use them for honest work instead of forcing others into misery?" The tattooed man frowned, his brows furrowing in irritation. He stepped toward Thin, his voice laced with menace. "Who do you think you are, old man? Preaching to us like that?" Thin's gaze didn't waver. "It doesn't matter who I am," he said, his voice steady but piercing. "What matters is that if you keep living like this, it won't end well for you. Sooner or later, you'll face the consequences." At that moment, Hai Lua, who had been silently observing from the doorway, finally spoke. His voice was low, cutting, and mocking. "Old man, do you really think your words mean anything to us? Or do you fancy yourself a hero saving these people?" Thin turned his sharp eyes toward High, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I'm no hero," he replied. "I'm just an old man who speaks up when something's wrong. But you should remember, no one stays on top forever. One day the wind will change, and when it does, you'll understand what it means to pay the price." The air in the shop seemed to freeze. For a long moment no one spoke. High stared at Thin, his expression unreadable, before finally smirking. "Let's go," he said to his men. "Let's see how long this old man can keep up his act." As the group filed out, Mrs. Min nearly collapsed from relief. Thin steadied her with a firm but gentle hand. "It's all right," he said softly. "Stay calm. They won't go too far." But deep down, Thin knew the danger was far from over. Men like Hailua didn't take defiance lightly. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thin sat on his porch, his old dog lying at his feet. He noticed movement in the shadows. Soon Hai returned, this time with 6 men. They marched to his home, their steps heavy with intent. The dog barked furiously, but when Thin remained calm, the dog fell silent. Hai climbed the steps to the porch, his eyes sharp as knives. "Old man," he said coldly, "I told you not to interfere." Thin didn't rise from his seat. Instead, he met Hai's glare with a calm, unwavering gaze. "Why didn't you listen to us?" Mr. Thin sat there, calm, unfazed by the threatening tone. He looked directly at Hai and said firmly, "Did you come here to talk or to cause trouble?" Hai smirked, his expression filled with disdain. "Don't think just because you're old that we'll spare you," he sneered. A young thug from Hai's gang stepped forward, intending to shove Mr. Thin's chair. But before he could react, Mr. Thin, quick as lightning, grabbed the man's arm and twisted it behind his back. The thug cried out in pain, collapsing to his knees. The others lunged forward to attack, but with a few swift and calculated movements, Mr. Thin had already taken down 2 more. The remaining gang members froze, stunned. How could this frail old man possess such strength and agility? Hai stood still, narrowing his eyes as if reevaluating his opponent. Finally, he said, "Impressive, old man. I didn't expect this from you, but don't think this is over. Next time, I won't come alone." With that, he signaled for his men to retreat, leaving behind 3 groaning bodies on the ground. Mr. Thin remained seated, watching them leave without giving chase. Yet, as their silhouettes disappeared into the distance, a shadow of worry crossed his eyes. He knew this was only the beginning. The real storm hadn't arrived yet. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the banyan tree in his yard, Mr. Thin was already awake. He sipped his hot tea in quiet contemplation. The cheerful chirping of birds overhead did little to ease the heavy clouds of concern swirling in his mind. Since Hai's gang retreated yesterday, Mr. Thin had been certain they wouldn't stop. These were not men who gave up easily. On the contrary, resistance only fueled their determination. He wasn't afraid for himself. But the villagers, the kind, simple people who lived around him, could they withstand what was coming? The sound of hurried footsteps broke his train of thought. Mrs. Min, the owner of the village's small grocery store, rushed into the yard, her face pale and full of panic. "Mr. Thin, they're back!" she gasped, struggling to catch her breath. Mr. Thin stood up calmly, placing his teacup on the table. "Take a deep breath. Tell me exactly what happened." Mrs. Min nodded, still trembling. "This morning, they went to Mr. Dung's P.O. shop at the edge of the village. I was passing by when I heard the sound of smashing. They were destroying his place. They even beat Mr. Dung. His wife and kids were terrified and didn't dare say a word. They shouted that they'll visit every house one by one. If we don't pay up, they said we can forget about living peacefully." Hearing this, Mr. Thin's expression darkened. Though he had anticipated their return, he hadn't expected them to escalate so quickly and violently. "Go home, Mrs. Min," he said gently but firmly. "Lock your doors and stay calm. I'll handle this." Reluctantly, Mrs. Min left, her heart still heavy with fear. After seeing her out, Mr. Thin returned inside. He walked slowly to the corner of his house where an old wooden cabinet stood. Opening it, he pulled out a dusty wooden box, long forgotten by time. When he lifted the lid, fragments of his past came into view: a tattered military cap, a small notebook, and a few faded army medals. But these weren't what he was looking for. At the bottom of the box lay another notebook, its leather cover worn and cracked. Inside were neatly written names, phone numbers, and addresses in a bold, steady handwriting. He flipped through the pages until he found the name he was searching for: Nguyen Van Son. Mr. Sun was an old comrade from the war, a trusted ally during the fiercest battles. After their military service, Mr. Sun had continued working in security forces. Though now retired, he remained an influential figure in the province's Veterans Association. If anyone could help Mr. Thin confront Hai and his gang, it was him. Picking up the phone, Mr. Thin dialed the number. A familiar voice answered from the other end, deep and steady, tinged with surprise. "Thin, it's been ages. What's going on?" "It's not good news, son," Mr. Thin replied, his tone grave. "I need your help. There's a gang causing havoc in my village. Extortion, threats, violence. They've already hurt people and they won't stop." Mr. Sun was silent for a moment before asking, "How many are there?" "Are they armed?" "I'm not sure about their exact numbers," Mr. Thin admitted, "but I know they're plenty. Their leader, Hai, is dangerous, reckless, and aggressive. They've already confronted me, and I have no doubt they'll be back." "Understood," Mr. Sun said firmly. "I'll head down immediately. Give me a few hours." As the call ended, Mr. Thin felt a slight weight lift from his chest. Help was on the way, but deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The fight ahead would test not only his strength, but the resilience of the entire village. Of Mr. Sun was only a small spark of courage in a village drowning in fear, fear that desperately needed awakening. He couldn't fight alone. Just as expected, later that afternoon, Hai Lua returned with an even larger group. This time, there were unfamiliar faces, likely thugs from elsewhere. They didn't come empty-handed. Crude weapons like wooden clubs and pocket knives were in their hands. The roaring engines of their motorbikes echoed through the village, breaking its fragile silence. Doors slammed shut, curtains were drawn. The villagers stayed inside, trembling. Outside, Hai and his gang gathered in front of Mr. Thin's house, shouting and taunting. "Old man, come out and talk. Let's see if you can keep preaching this time." Hai's voice cut through the stillness, full of menace. Mr. Thin stepped out, calm and unshaken. His old dog followed, barking a few times before lying silently at his feet. The old man stared at Hai, his eyes unwavering. "What do you want this time?" Mr. Thin asked firmly. Hai smirked, gesturing toward his gang. "It's simple. You don't know how to listen, so I'm here to teach you a lesson. Do you think smashing my house or making threats will make me submit?" Mr. Thin's voice was cold and steady. "I've faced things far scarier than you." Hai burst into mocking laughter. "We'll see how long you last. Bring this house down," he shouted to his gang. The thugs prepared to charge, but suddenly a commanding voice rang out. "Stop!" Everyone froze and turned to see a group of people approaching. It was Mr. Sun, leading a group of retired soldiers. They wore white shirts with red armbands, and their disciplined steps echoed their military past. Though they carried no weapons, their stern faces and resolute gazes made Hai's gang hesitate. Mr. Sun stepped forward, standing next to Mr. Thin. He stared straight at Hai. "You're Hai Lua, aren't you? I've heard of you. Let me be clear. This is a peaceful village. It's not a place for your chaos. If you continue, we will not stand by and watch." Hai hesitated, caught off guard by their sudden appearance, but soon his arrogance returned. "A bunch of old men like you? What can you do? Don't think your empty threats will scare me." Mr. Sun remained composed. "You don't need to be scared, but if you're smart, you'll leave before things escalate." Hai glanced around and noticed villagers beginning to gather in the distance. Their faces, once filled with fear, now showed glimmers of hope. Unwilling to risk further confrontation, Hai turned to his gang and ordered, "Let's go." "But next time, it won't be this easy." As they sped away, Mr. Sun turned to Mr. Thin and said quietly, "For now, we're safe. But they'll be back, and next time, it'll be worse." "I know," Mr. Thin nodded, "but we'll be ready." That night, under the flickering glow of an oil lamp, Mr. Thin and Mr. Sun sat together, discussing their next steps. They decided to rally the villagers, gathering those capable of defending their homes to form a self-defense team. They also agreed to investigate Hai's gang, gathering intelligence to develop a long-term strategy. Slowly, the village began to regain its spirit. The retired soldiers organized training sessions, teaching basic self-defense techniques and how to use simple tools like bamboo sticks and ropes for protection. The once quiet village, filled with fear, now burned with a quiet determination. It was a simmering flame, ready to ignite if necessary. Meanwhile, in an abandoned warehouse near the city, Hai and his gang were meeting. Frustrated and furious, Hai slammed his hand on the table. "Those old fools think we're afraid of them? I'll show them what real fear looks like." Determined to crush the resistance, Hai reached out to another criminal group for reinforcements. This time he planned to bring firearms. "Mr. Thin, Mr. Sun, you think you can stop me? Just wait, you'll see," Hai muttered, his eyes burning with rage. The storm was brewing. It wasn't just a conflict anymore, it was war. The once peaceful village now stood on the edge of chaos, but this time they were no longer alone. In the shadows, men and women who had faced battles before were preparing for a confrontation that would demand everything they had. Night fell, and the village was shrouded in darkness. The wind rustled through the bamboo groves, creating a haunting symphony, as if nature itself was whispering a warning. Behind the small windows, faint lights flickered. The villagers no longer went about their usual routines. No one stepped outside. No one raised their voices. They all knew something was coming, but this time the fear was no longer paralyzing. It was joined by something else: resolve. Beneath the calm exterior of the village lay a fierce determination, ignited by men like Mr. Thin and his group of war veterans. Mr. Thin sat on a wooden chair outside his house, holding a still warm cup of tea in his hands. Yet his gaze wasn't on the cup. His eyes were fixed on the dirt road in front of him, the same road that had witnessed countless steps of Hai Lua and his gang. In his mind, battle strategies formed as clearly as they had in the fierce battles of his youth, but this time, the enemy wasn't on a battlefield. This time, the threat came from within, troublemakers wreaking havoc in his very homeland. From inside the house, Mr. Sun emerged. He had just finished inspecting the self-defense team that they had assembled in the village. The team wasn't made up solely of the strong and young. It also included elders who had served in the military. With guidance from the veterans, these villagers were trained to use sticks, ropes, and even learned how to signal in emergencies. "We're ready," Mr. Sun said in a steady, firm tone, the same tone he once used to give commands on the battlefield. "When they come, everyone knows what to do." Mr. Thin nodded, his eyes never leaving the road. "They'll come, I'm certain of it, and this time we'll make them understand. This is no place for them to run wild." Meanwhile, not far from the village, in an abandoned warehouse, Hai Lua and his gang were gearing up for what he called the final attack. This time, he wasn't just bringing his usual crew. He had called for reinforcements from a larger gang in the city. The newcomers, menacing in appearance, hid weapons under leather jackets. They were proof of the danger Hai was willing to bring to the village. "We're not just scaring those old fools this time," Hai growled, his voice sharp with fury. "I'm going to crush that village. I want them to know. Messing with Hai Lua means death." "But that old man Thin isn't ordinary," one of his lackeys hesitated. "Last time he took down some of our guys in just a few moves." "Then this time I'll deal with him myself," Hai snarled, his tone dripping with menace. "I'll make sure he learns nobody stands against me and survives." As dawn broke the next morning, the atmosphere in the village grew heavy. The distant rumble of motorbike engines echoed like the sound of war drums, signaling an inevitable clash. Hai Lua led the convoy of motorbikes, more than 20 men following him, including the reinforcements from the city. The city men rode sleek, black motorbikes, the outlines of handguns faintly visible in their jacket pockets. They stormed into the village like a whirlwind, revving engines, shouting, and trying to create chaos. But this time there were no screams of panic. No villagers ran out in fear. The village was eerily quiet, the silence unsettling. The only sound was the roaring of the motorbikes reverberating through the air. Something felt off. Hai frowned, sensing the strangeness. "Where are they?" he barked, glancing back at his men. No one answered. The convoy moved deeper into the village. Suddenly, a long whistle pierced the air. Hai whipped around, startled. Before he could react, villagers began appearing from both sides of the road. They didn't scatter in fear. Instead, they stood in small, organized groups, armed with bamboo sticks, hoes, and shovels. Some villagers perched on rooftops, throwing bags of sand and rocks down, forcing the gang's bikes to swerve and retreat. One of Hai's men yelled, but the path behind them was already blocked. From both ends of the village, Mr. Thin's self-defense team emerged, bolstered by the veterans. They formed an unyielding circle, trapping Hai and his gang in a tight ring. "You think this will stop me?" Hai shouted, his voice full of rage. He pulled a long knife from his jacket and charged straight at Mr. Thin like a cornered tiger. But Mr. Thin remained calm, his eyes steady and unwavering. As Hai swung his knife, Mr. Thin sidestepped with the agility of a snake. In a flash, he delivered a precise kick to Hai's hand, sending the knife clattering to the ground. Hai staggered, but quickly regained his balance and lunged again. The fight between Hai and Mr. Thin unfolded before the eyes of everyone. No one interfered. They all understood this was a duel between two men, a battle that would decide everything. Mr. Thin, with decades of honed skill, didn't attack recklessly. He waited, observing Hai's movements, striking only when necessary. Each blow was calculated and effective, gradually wearing Hai down. Hai grew increasingly frustrated, his attacks becoming sloppy and desperate. Finally, with a powerful move, Mr. Thin threw Hai to the ground. Breathing heavily, Mr. Thin stood over him. His voice was calm yet commanding. "You've lost. Stop before it's too late." Hai lay on the ground, his eyes blazing with fury, but his body too weak to rise. For the first time in his life, he felt true fear. He realized there was no way out. Seeing their leader defeated, Hai's men began to surrender. Some dropped their weapons and fled, while most stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The battle was over, but its echoes would linger long in the memory of everyone present. For Hai, it marked the end of his reign of terror. For the village, it was a moment of unity, a testament to their courage and resilience. The judgment was swift. Mr. Sun, along with a group of seasoned veterans, quickly subdued the remaining criminals. Villagers slowly emerged, their faces a mixture of satisfaction and relief. The police, whom Mr. Sun had contacted earlier, arrived just in time. Hai and his gang were arrested and taken away. For the first time in days, the villagers could breathe a sigh of relief. But more than that, they realized the power of unity. It was the leadership of Mr. Thin and the bravery of the veterans that had secured this victory. That evening, a warm atmosphere enveloped Mr. Thin's house. The villagers gathered to express their gratitude to him and the self-defense team, but Mr. Thin simply smiled, his gaze distant as if lost in memories of the past. "We didn't win because we were stronger," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We won because of trust and unity. Evil cannot prevail when everyone stands together to resist it." Outside, the full moon cast its soft light upon the village. A dark chapter had come to an end, ushering in a new future, one where the people could live in peace and pride. Amidst it all, Mr. Thin sat quietly, like a soldier who had just fulfilled his mission. The night sky above the village was crystal clear. The moon, like a silver plate, hung high in the heavens, illuminating the old tiled roofs and red dirt paths. The village seemed serene once again after weeks of turmoil. Yet, within Mr. Thin, a faint unease lingered, like the faint whistle of wind slipping through the bamboo by the pond. Even though High's gang had been apprehended, he knew that the ordeal wasn't truly over. This wasn't just about facing a small gang's brutality. It was about confronting a larger, more dangerous force that High had hinted at in his threats. Inside his modest home, Mr. Thin sat at a wooden table. A dim oil lamp flickered, casting shadows over faded metals on the corner of the desk. Before him lay a blank sheet of paper, a pen ready in its place. Yet he hadn't begun to write. His mind churned, deliberating every word, every step he needed to take. Suddenly, hurried footsteps approached the door. Mr. Sun entered, his face stern and tense. He brought troubling news. "I just got word from the police," Mr. Sun said in a low, urgent voice. "The ones in the city are stirring. They're not happy that we've brought this into the spotlight. It seems they're planning to send someone down to deal with it." Mr. Thin lifted his head, his gaze steady and calm as always. "I knew they would act sooner or later," he said. "The way High operated, it was clear he wasn't the only one pulling the strings. We're likely about to face forces far more dangerous." Mr. Sun sat down, poured himself a cup of tea, and looked directly at Mr. Thin. "This time," he said solemnly, "it won't be like before. If they come, they won't just want to intimidate us. They'll want to destroy everything. Can the villagers endure more?" Mr. Thin placed the pen down and gazed out the window, where moonlight bathed his garden. "These villagers," he said slowly, "have endured countless floods and years of war. They are no strangers to hardship, but this is no longer just about endurance. We've awakened something greater within them, faith and courage. If they come, I believe the villagers will stand strong as long as we lead them the right way." Mr. Sun fell silent, his eyes reflecting both concern and agreement. He knew that within his old friend's mind, a plan had already begun to take shape, and he trusted Mr. Thin just as he had trusted his commander during the fierce battles of the past. 2 days later, the village's fragile peace was shattered. From afar, the roar of engines echoed along the road leading to the village. This time, it wasn't the old, battered motorcycles of High's gang. Instead, 3 large trucks and 2 sleek SUVs approached, their polished exteriors glinting under the sun. Inside were men with cold, hardened expressions, armed with guns and knives, advancing as though preparing for a real battle. The villagers, upon seeing the vehicles from a distance, quickly shut their doors. But this time, their eyes were not filled with fear or despair. Instead, there was tension mingled with resolve. They knew they weren't alone. The self-defense team had been preparing for this moment. Mr. Thin, Mr. Sun, and the veterans had carefully devised a strategy. Small groups were stationed at key points, from the village gate to the riverbank. Bamboo traps and hidden sand pits had been set up. skillfully concealed under layers of dried leaves. The once peaceful village had been transformed into a covert battlefield. As the convoy moved deeper into the village, the gang began to sense something was off. The streets were eerily silent. There were no children playing, no roosters crowing, no dogs barking. The air seemed heavy, frozen in time. Only the sound of their engines broke the stillness. A man in the back truck stuck his head out and looked around. "What the hell's going on here?" he shouted. "Did they all run and hide?" The man in the lead SUV, a tall, imposing figure with piercing eyes, tapped the steering wheel rhythmically. This was Long Ho, a major figure in the city's underworld. Hai had merely been a pawn under his command. Hai's capture had forced him into action. Calmly, in a deep, commanding voice, he replied, "They think they can hide from me. They'll learn soon enough." Just as his words faded, a shrill whistle echoed from somewhere within the village. It was the signal the self-defense team had been waiting for. From both sides of the road, large bamboo poles suddenly fell, blocking the path. The convoy screeched to a halt. Bags of sand and rocks rained down from above, shattering windshields. Panic erupted among the gang members, who scrambled out of the vehicles, drawing their weapons. But there was no one in sight. "What kind of game are they playing?" one of them shouted, his voice trembling with frustration. Long said nothing. His sharp eyes scanned the surroundings, realizing they were surrounded. In the distance, figures began to emerge, but these weren't armed soldiers. They were farmers, wielding hoes, shovels, and bamboo sticks. Yet their eyes held no fear, only determination. Mr. Thin stepped out from a hidden corner, calm and composed as ever. Beside him stood Mr. Sun and the other veterans. His voice rang out deep and clear. "You think you can use force to subdue this place? This is not your city. This is our village, a place where we've lived for generations. No one will be allowed to destroy it." Long smirked coldly, pulling a pistol from his belt. "Old man," he sneered, "do you really think a few traps and some villagers with sticks can stop me?" "Maybe not," Mr. Thin replied, his gaze unwavering. "But it will show you that true strength doesn't come from weapons." The battle began. The self-defense team, guided by the veterans, moved swiftly through narrow alleys, dividing and isolating Long's men. The hidden traps disoriented the criminals, causing injuries and confusion. The villagers' precise strikes, combined with the veterans' strategic guidance, gradually tipped the scales. Even Long's ruthless determination faltered as he realized the trap he'd walked into. His men fell one by one, not to bullets, but to the unity and determination of a seemingly weak community. Finally surrounded and alone, Long let out a dry, bitter laugh. He raised his trembling pistol, his voice laced with defiance. "You've won, old man, but do you even know what you're fighting against? Your life means nothing compared to the forces behind me." Mr. Thin stepped forward, his eyes filled with unyielding authority. "You're wrong. No matter how powerful they are, they're nothing more than dust when faced with the will of the people. When a village stands united, no one can threaten us." Long hesitated, his hand trembling as he tried to pull the trigger. But a commanding voice rang out, "Drop your weapon!" The police had arrived, surrounding the area completely. Long was finally apprehended, his eyes burning with rage but filled with helplessness. That night, the village was silent once more. The villagers gathered in the communal yard, their faces lit with smiles and laughter for the first time in months. The elderly recounted stories of courage and unity, of how they had risen to defend their home. Mr. Thin sat quietly in a corner, watching the joyful faces around him. He knew this victory wasn't just about defeating the enemy, it was a triumph of faith, solidarity, and courage. As the moon cast its gentle light over the village, Mr. Thin felt a sense of peace wash over him, like the soft glow illuminating the red dirt paths. The next morning, golden sunlight flooded the village, bringing with it a long-awaited sense of tranquility. The breeze rustled through the old bamboo groves and across the rippling rice fields. The village at last was at peace. The morning dew still clung to the lush green grass. For the first time in months, the village truly felt at peace. No more roaring motorbikes, no more shadows of fear brought by troublemakers. The air itself seemed to carry a fresh sense of hope, like a new beginning. Mr. Thin sat on a wooden chair in front of his house, holding a cup of hot tea. His face remained calm, but his eyes sparkled with a joy that was hard to put into words. The days of tension had finally come to an end. The notorious gang, led by Hai Lua and Long Ho, their ringleader, had been caught. Evidence of their illegal activities had been meticulously gathered by the police and the local self-defense team. It was enough to ensure they'd face justice and heavy punishment. The sound of footsteps pulled Mr. Thin out of his thoughts. It was Mr. Sun, his friend, approaching with a strong stride and a gentle smile. "Thin, now you can finally rest," Mr. Sun said, sitting down on the chair next to him. Mr. Thin chuckled softly but shook his head. "Rest? How can I rest, old friend? There's still so much work to be done. The seeds have just been sown. Now they need someone to nurture them so they can sprout and grow." Mr. Sun nodded as he looked around the village. Although the criminal gang had been eradicated, he knew the wounds they left behind were still there. Families who had been threatened, people who lived in fear, and even young men from the village who had been dragged into a life of wrongdoing. Healing would take time. As the two men talked, the sound of cheerful chatter echoed from the village square. The villagers were gathering for a special meeting. It wasn't just a celebration, it was an opportunity to strengthen the bonds of unity they had just rediscovered. Since early morning, families had been bringing food and drinks to the square, setting up what looked like a small market. Young men from the self-defense team arranged tables and chairs, built a bamboo stage, and prepared for a simple yet meaningful ceremony. As the sun climbed higher, the loudspeaker called everyone to gather. Mr. Thin and Mr. Sun walked to the square together. The warm, welcoming smiles of the villagers made them feel both respected and cherished. On stage, Mr. Dung, the local noodle shop owner, stood to give a speech. His voice was strong, filled with emotion. "Brothers and sisters, today we celebrate not just our victory over the criminals, but also the return of peace to our village. We owe our thanks to Mr. Thin, Mr. Sun, and the self-defense team for leading us through those dark days." Applause erupted. All eyes turned toward Mr. Thin, but he simply raised his hand, signaling for quiet. He stepped onto the stage, scanning the familiar faces before speaking in his deep, steady voice. "My dear friends, I don't deserve all this gratitude. Without the determination of every one of you, we wouldn't have been able to protect our village. True strength doesn't lie in one individual. It lies in our unity. That's what makes us strong." The applause returned, louder and longer this time. In the crowd, some eyes were brimming with tears. These were the eyes of those who had once lost all hope, but now felt protected and full of faith in the future. After the ceremony, Mr. Thin, Mr. Sun, and the self-defense team stayed behind to talk with the villagers. Some suggested maintaining the self-defense group to prevent similar situations in the future. Others discussed rebuilding shops and homes that had been damaged by the gang. Meanwhile, someone quietly entered the village. It was Hai Lua. He had been released early from prison thanks to his cooperation in exposing Long Ho's network. But he was no longer the arrogant, aggressive man he once was. Wearing a simple shirt, his figure was thinner, and his eyes were downcast. He walked toward the village square where Mr. Thin was sitting with some villagers. When they saw Hai, everyone fell silent. Their eyes reflected surprise and caution. Mr. Thin turned to look at him, his expression calm, without a trace of anger or astonishment. Hai knelt down before him, his voice trembling. "Mr. Thin, I came to apologize. I was wrong. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I still wanted to say I'm sorry." The square was completely silent except for the sound of the wind rustling through the bamboo. Mr. Thin looked at Hai for a long moment before speaking gently. "You're right. You were wrong. But realizing your mistakes and wanting to make amends is something not everyone can do. You wrong this village, and it's the villagers who will decide whether you deserve a chance to start over." Hai bowed his head deeply, unable to say another word. After a pause, Mr. Thin stood up and pointed toward a group of young men gathered in the corner of the square. "If you're sincere, start here. Join the self-defense team. Learn to protect the people you once hurt. You don't need to talk much, just let your actions speak for you." Hai nodded, tears streaming down his sunken face. He stood up and slowly walked toward the group. At first, their eyes were wary, but gradually they softened, as if to offer him a chance. Time passed and the village changed day by day. Homes that had been destroyed were rebuilt. The shops bustled with activity again. The self-defense team not only protected the village, but also held self-defense training sessions to teach villagers how to handle dangerous situations. With Mr. Thin's guidance, Hai became one of the most active members of the team. He was no longer the brash, reckless man he once was. Instead, he had become calm and determined, working tirelessly to redeem himself. One evening, as the sun set, Mr. Thin sat on his porch watching children play on the street. Mr. Sun joined him, handing him a cup of tea. "So you did it, Thin," Mr. Sun said with a hint of pride in his voice. "Not only did you protect the village, but you also helped a man change his life." Mr. Thin smiled, his gaze distant. "Sometimes victory isn't about defeating an enemy, it's about helping them find the right path. That's what gives me the most satisfaction." From afar, the sound of children's laughter blended with the rustling bamboo in the breeze. Under the fiery red sky of sunset, the village was no longer just a place of peace. It had become a place of hope, built on unity and compassion that would endure for generations to come.